Welcome back to Connected Planet Learning and our reading of Island of the Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell. Today we are going to continue reading chapter 14 and see what happens next. I really hope you had a chance to think about predictions of what might happen next. Thinking about what we left off with. What was she thinking as she was trying to hobble home with her leg hurt in the dark after not being able to catch the elephant seal bull that she was wanting to get a tooth from to make a spear. Now remember, she's been wanting to make a spear to get rid of the wild dogs on the island for a really long time. But she needed to make sure she had a safe place to be first. So now she was wanting to go out and get an elephant seal tooth so that she could finally get rid of these wild dogs. And she keeps thinking, oh, am I allowed to use a weapon? Because there was a superstition of women using the weapons and making weapons in her village. So hopefully you've had a chance to think about that, make a prediction, try and put yourself in her place and think what she is thinking about. Try and figure out what she is thinking about, as well as how she might feel all alone on this island. As usual, if you want to use any of the resources on Connected Planet Learning as we are reading, you are welcome to use them, print them out. They are free. Just make sure you sign up and agree to the educational use agreement on the website. So let's continue with chapter 14. Here we go. My leg hurt so much by the time I had reached the house that it was hard for me to crawl under the fence and move aside the heavy rock. For 5 suns, so remember 1 sun is 1 day, 5 suns is 5 days, I could not go out because my leg had swollen so badly and I had no herbs with which to treat it. I had enough food to eat, but on the 3rd day the water in the basket ran low. 2 days later, the basket was empty. It was necessary for me to go to the spring in the ravine. I started out there when the sun rose. I took with me shellfish to eat, also my spear and my bow and arrows. I went very slowly, for I had to crawl on my hands and knees carrying the food tied to my back, dragging the weapons. There was a short way to the spring, but it was over many rocks which I could not climb. So I had to take a longer way through the brush. I reached the ravine when the sun was overhead. The spring was not far off, and I rested there, though I was very thirsty, cutting a lobe from a cactus bush to chew on. While I was resting there, sucking the juice from the cactus, I saw the big gray dog, the leader of the wild pack, in the brush above me. His head was down, and he was moving slowly, sniffing the tracks I made. He saw me soon after I saw him and stopped. Behind him was the rest of the pack trotting along after one another. The pack stopped too. I took up my bow and fitted an arrow, but as I did this, the dog faded away into the brush and was quickly followed by the others. In the time of one breath, they were gone. There was nothing to aim my arrow at. It was as if they had not been there at all. I listened. They were moving so silently I could not hear their steps, but I was sure that they would try to surround me. Slowly I crawled on, stopping to listen and glance back to measure the distance between me and the spring. My leg hurt. I left my bow and arrows behind as I went on, for the brush had grown heavy and I could not use them. In one hand I dragged my spear. I came to the spring. It flowed out of a crack in the rock, and the rock rose high on 3 sides of it. The wild dogs could not attack me from any of these directions, so I lay on the earth and drank, watching the ravine below me. I drank for a long time and filled my basket, and then, feeling better, crawled toward the mouth of the cave. The ledge of the black rock ran above it. Some low bushes grew there, and among them, with just his head showing, stood the big gray dog. He did not move, but his yellow eyes followed me, turning slowly as I drew near the cave. Another head showed behind him, and another. They were too far away for me to reach with my spear. Suddenly, I saw brush moving on the opposite bank of the ravine. The pack had split up and were waiting on both sides of the ravine for me to pass them. The cave was now in front of me. I crawled to the mouth of it and in it. Above me, I could hear feet running and the cracking of brush, which was followed by silence. I was safe. I knew the wild dogs would come back, and they did as night fell, stalking around in the brush until morning, but not venturing close. Although the mouth of the cave was small, once you were inside, it spread out and you could stand up. Water dropped from the roof and the cave was cold without a fire. But here I stayed for 6 suns until my leg was well, crawling out only once to fetch water from the spring. While I was living there, I decided I would make the cave another house where I could stay should I get hurt or sick. And this I did as soon as I was strong and could walk. The cave went far back into the hill around many turns, but I needed only that part which lay near the opening and which the sun could reach during some of the day. A long time before this, my ancestors had used the cave. Why, I did not know. Along the walls on each side, they had cut figures in stone. There were figures of pelicans floating on the water and flying, of dolphins, whales, sea elephants, gulls, ravens, dogs, and foxes. Near the opening of the cave, they had also cut 2 deep basins in stone, which I decided to use for storing water, since they held much more than my baskets. I made shelves on the sides of the rocks as I had done in the other house and gathered shellfish and seeds to store there. I also gathered herbs from the hill above and spring in case I should need them. The bow and arrows I had first made I likewise took to the cave. At last, after I had made a good bed of seaweed and collected dry wood for my fires, I closed the opening with stones except for a small hole at the top, which I could crawl through. All this I did, thinking of the days I had been sick and without water. It was hard work, much of it a man's work, but not until I finished did I go back to the place where the sea elephants lived. The tide was low, and when I reached it, far up on the slope lay the body of the old bull. Gulls had picked his bones clean, but I found what I came for. Some of the teeth were as long as my hand and half its width. They were curved at the tops, and some were broken. But when I had ground the best of them down with sand, I had for my work 4 good spear points, broad at the bottom and very sharp at the ends. I made more spears from these points, and at last was ready to go to the cave of the wild dogs. So, she got hurt, but she didn't blame the superstition on what happened. She continued making her weapons. So she's very, very strong. So what did she decide to do? She was very clever. She found this cave and decided to have 2 homes. One would be like her summer home, right? Or her when everything is good home. And then if she were to get sick, she'd have the cave near a source of water so she would be able to always get water when she needed. So now she's built 2 homes. She came back and found that the old elephant seal was dead, which means the younger one won that battle, and she didn't actually have to kill one. It was already dead, but she found some good teeth. Let's continue with chapter 15, see what happens. So now she's after the wild dogs. Let's see if this goes well or not. There had been wild dogs on the island of the Blue Dolphins as long as I can remember. But after the Alouds had slain most of the men of our tribes and their dogs had left to join the others, the pack became much bolder. It spent the nights running through the village, and during the day it was never far off. It was then that we made plans to get rid of them, but the ship came and everyone left Galisat. I am sure that the pack grew bolder because of their leader, the big one with thick fur around his neck and the yellow eyes. I had never seen this dog before the Alouds came, and no one else had. So he must have come with them and been left behind when they sailed away. He was a much larger dog than any of ours, which besides have short hair and brown eyes, I was sure he was an Aloud dog. I'd already killed 5 of the pack, but there were many left, more than in the beginning, for some had been born in the meantime. The young dogs were even wilder than the old ones. I first went to the hill near the cave when the pack was away and collected armloads of brush, which I placed near the mouth of their lair. Then I waited until the pack was in the cave. I went there early in the morning to sleep after it had spent the night prowling. I took with me the big bow and 5 arrows and 2 of the spears. I went quietly, circling around the mouth of the cave, and came up to it from the side. There I left all of my weapons except 1 spear. I set fire to the brush and pushed it into the cave. If the wild dogs heard me, there was no sound from them. Nearby was a ledge of rock, and I climbed, taking my weapons with me. The fire burned high. Some of the smoke trailed out over the hill, but much of it stayed in the cave. Soon the pack would have to leave. I did not hope to kill more than 5 of them because I only had that many arrows. But if the leader was one of the 5, I would be satisfied. It might be wiser if I waited and saved all my arrows for him, and this I decided to do. None of the dogs appeared before the fire died. Then 3 ran out and away. 7 more followed, and a long time afterwards, like number, there were many more still left in the cave. The leader came next. Unlike the others, he did not run away. He jumped over the ashes and stood at the mouth of the cave, sniffing the air. I was so close to him that I could see his nose quivering, but he did not see me until I raised my bow. Fortunately, I did not frighten him. He stood facing me, his front legs spread as if he were ready to spring. His yellow eyes narrowed to slits. The arrow struck him in the chest. He turned away from me, took 1 step, and fell. I sent another arrow toward him which went wide. At this time, 3 more dogs trotted out of the cave. I sent the last of my arrows and killed 2 of them. Carrying both of the spears, I climbed down from the ledge and went through the brush to the place where the leader had fallen. He was not there. He couldn't have gone far because of his wound, but though I looked everywhere around the ledge where I'd been standing and in front of the cave, I could not find him. I waited for a long time and then went inside the cave. It was deep, but I could see clearly. Far back in the corner was a half-eaten carcass of a fox. Beside it was a black dog with 4 gray puppies. One of the pups came slowly toward me, a round ball of fur that I could have held in my hand. I wanted to hold it, but the mother leaped to her feet and bared her teeth. I raised my spear as I backed out of the cave, yet I did not use it. The wounded leader was not there. Night was coming, and I left the cave going along the foot of the hill that led to the cliff. I had not gone far on this trail that the wild dogs used when I saw the broken shaft of an arrow. It had been gnawed off near the tip, and I knew it was from the arrow which had wounded the leader. Further on I saw his tracks in the dust. They were uneven, as if he were traveling slowly. I followed them toward the cliff, but finally lost them in the darkness. The next day and the next it rained, and I did not go look for him. I spent those days making more arrows, and on the 3rd day, with these arrows and my spear, I went out along the trail the wild dogs had made to and from my house. There were no tracks after the rain, but I followed the trail to a pile of rocks where I had seen them before. On the far side of the rocks, I found the big gray dog. He had the broken arrow in his chest and was lying on one of his legs under him. He was about 10 paces from me, so I could see him clearly. I was sure that he was dead, but I lifted my spear and took good aim at him. Just as I was about to throw the spear, he raised his head a little from the earth and then let it drop. This surprised me greatly, as I stood there for a while not knowing what to do, whether to use the spear or my bow. I was used to animals playing dead until they suddenly turned on you or ran away. The spear was the better of the 2 weapons at this distance, but I could not use it as well as the other, so I climbed onto the rocks where I could see him if he ran. I placed my feet carefully. I had a second arrow ready should I need it. I fitted an arrow and pulled back the string, aiming at his head. Why I did not send the arrow, I cannot say. I stood on the rock with the bow pulled back and my hand would not let it go. The big dog lay there and did not move, and this may be the reason. If it had gotten up, I would have killed him. I stood there for a long time looking down at him, and then I climbed off the rocks. He did not move when I went up to him, nor could I see him breathing until I was very close. The head of the arrow was in his chest, and the broken shaft was covered with blood. The thick fur around his neck was matted from the rain. I do not think he knew I was picking him up, for his body was limp, as if he were dead. He was very heavy, and the only way I could lift him was by kneeling and putting his legs around my shoulders. In this manner, stopping to rest when I was tired, I carried him to the headland. I could not get through the opening under the fence, so I cut the bindings and lifted 2 of the whale ribs and took him into the house. He did not look at me or raise his head when I laid him on the floor, but his mouth was open and he was breathing. The arrow had a small point, which was fortunate and came out easily, though it had gone deep. He did not move while I did this, nor afterward, as I cleaned the wound with a peeled stick from a coral bush. This bush has poisonous berries, yet its wood often heals wounds that nothing else will. I had not gathered food for many days, and the baskets were empty, so I left water for the dog, and after mending the fence, went down to the sea. I had no thought that he would live. I did not care. All day long I was among the rocks, gathering shellfish, and only once did I think of the wounded dog, my enemy, lying there in the house, and then wondered why I had not killed him. He was still alive when I got back, though he did not move from the place where I had left him. Again I cleaned the wound with coral twig, then I lifted his head and put water in his mouth, and he swallowed. This was the first time he looked at me since the time I had found him on the trail. His eyes were sunken, and they looked out at me from far back in his head. Before I went to sleep, I gave him more water. In the morning, I left food for him when I went down to the sea, and when I came home, he had eaten it. He was lying on the corner watching me. While I made a fire and cooked my supper, he watched me. His yellow eyes followed me wherever I moved. That night I slept on the rock, for I was afraid of him, and at dawn I went out and left the hole under the fence open so he could go. But he was there when I got back, lying in the sun with his head on his paws. I had speared 2 fish, which I cooked for supper. Since he was very thin, I gave him one of them, and after he had eaten it, he came over and lay down by the fire, watching me with his yellow eyes that were very narrow and slanted up at the corners. 4 nights I slept on the rock, and every morning I left the hole under the fence open so he could leave. Each day I speared a fish for him, and when I got home he was always at the fence waiting for me. He would not take the fish from me, so I had to put it on the ground. Once I held out my hand to him, but he backed away and showed his teeth. On the 4th day, when I came back from the rocks early, he was not there at the fence waiting. A strange feeling came over me. Always before, when I returned, I had hoped he would be gone. But now, as I crawled under the fence, I did not feel the same. I called out, "Dog! Dog!" for I had no other name for him. I ran toward the house, calling it. He was inside. He was just getting to his feet, stretching himself and yawning. He looked first at the fish I carried and then at me, and moved his tail. That night I stayed in the house. Before I fell asleep, I thought of a name for him, for I could not call him Dog. The name I thought of was Rontu, which in our language means fox eyes. Oh my goodness! What a twist in the story! So, she couldn't kill the wild dog. And now she has a pet. We don't know what this pet relationship is going to be like, but one name that you're going to need to remember is Rontu. So Rontu is the dog. So now she has a pet, and the pet is the dog that killed her brother. And she was actually wanting to kill it, but that couldn't happen. She just couldn't do it, and she doesn't know why. What do you guys think of that? What do you think of that? Let's see what you think might happen next. And think about how she has evolved. How has she changed? How has Wanapale changed throughout this story? Okay, so one thing I want you to think about is there are different types of characters in stories. There are static characters. Static means that they don't change much. They stay the same. Okay, we haven't really read about terribly many characters in the story, but so far the ones that are static characters or don't have much importance are villagers and her sister and her dad, right? They kind of all stayed the same. They didn't evolve, at least not in the story. Wanapale is what we call a dynamic character. She is changing throughout the story. She's having to try new things. She's having to try and open her mind to how she's going to survive on this island. So think about her as a dynamic or changing character. How has Wanapale changed so far in the story? You can also think about what has made her change. More importantly, why is she changing? And what has caused her to change. So if you're using a thinking journal page, take time to write that down. If you're using a parking lot, there's our fence. If you're using a parking lot, write it down. Think about yourself. How do you change? How do things that you encounter change you? As we are reading this story, we now discovered she has a pet. His name is Rantu. Let's find out what happens next. I will see you next time when we read chapter 16. See ya!